So this next part is going to be about humanity's past and also about ideas of the future. So I'm going to start off by saying that humans are strange creatures. We are the only known example of what happens when the cosmos becomes aware of itself. We know we were born and we know we will die. No other animal knows both. It is theorized that though modern humanity has been around for approximately 300,000 years, maybe 50,000 years more or so, we spent much of that time fighting wars over gods, and only recently, say the past 20,000 years ago, have we been really civilized as we are today. So there's the theory that the reason human beings have only been civilized recently is because we've just been killing each other for hundreds of thousands of years. And we still do that sometimes. We still have wars, we still kill each other, and it isn't obvious why we do those things, why we have wars. Like why do we send thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, of soldiers, like let's say you're the president, you send soldiers of your own country out to war. It's like what could get someone to do that? And there's arguments that, oh, it's just about corruption and power dynamics, and the leaders of the world rule with power and power rules. But I don't think that's true. I think these things are complicated, and I think it largely has to do with belief systems, with like culture. So even if it doesn't get physically violent, which it probably will at some point, but even if it doesn't, when you have two cultures, so it's like two worldviews that collide, it's as if those worldviews are represented by gods, and those gods are warring. So I say here in the second paragraph, I say the war between the gods is essentially the war between opposing views of the nature of reality. We attempt collectively to understand the cosmos. Our discoveries are documented to the degree to which they have been documented, largely in religious, mythological, and folklore narratives and principles, or commandments. So like axiomatic beliefs, laws, regulations, commandments, that sort of thing. But there's also there's behaviors, right? So you see in the Gospels, you see in Jesus that he acts a certain way, and the way that he acts is documented, and what he says is documented. And a lot of what he says, it isn't necessarily like beliefs you must adopt or laws that you can just directly get from it. You kind of have to think about that, and you kind of have to like do what he did, right? So it isn't clearly explained in the Gospels, like what you are to do in order to act like Christ. What happened to Christ is he told the truth. He was courageous, you could say. He did the right thing, and then the religious hypocrites, which are the Pharisees, crucify him, and so he dies for that, and somehow that redeems the world, right? Like that's very hard to understand, but that's a worldview, and that worldview is represented by a god. It's represented by the Christian God. I mean, in the Trinitarian sense, you can say there's three persons or whatever, but by a god. And then you can have another worldview, which is maybe similar-ish, but kind of different, like Islam or Judaism or Hinduism. And you can imagine that each one of those worldviews is represented by a god. And then you can imagine that when you get angry, for example, that when people are angry, there's a pattern of behavior associated with that anger. So yelling loudly, cussing, hitting things, looking very angry, getting red in the face. There's all sorts of behaviors and signals and things that are connected to anger. Well, when you have a worldview about how to act in the world, that can be represented by a god. And in Christianity, that's like God the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And in Islam, that's Allah. And in Judaism, it's Yahweh, whatever. Different worldviews are represented by different gods. And when those worldviews collide, it is as if those gods are warring. Okay. But there's also another way that this happens, and it's more internal. It's when you are experiencing different emotions. So you're happy, and then you're sad, and then you're mad, and then you're joyful, and then you're hungry, and then you're tired. And you have all these things, all these gods, and they're warring against each other. And if you have them all at the same level, then you're confused. You don't know what to do. You have no idea what to do. But if you have them in a hierarchy, then you know what to do. Because if all these gods up here, or emotions, or whatever you want to call them, or demons, whatever, if all of these gods up here are satisfied, but there's like one god right here, like anger, who isn't satisfied, you can pay attention to that one. But if there's one that you set above that, like hunger, let's say that, for, I don't know if this is actually true, but let's say that hunger's more important than anger. Well, then you'll, if you're like a 2-year-old, you'll immediately stop being angry, and then you'll start being hungry. Right, and so you have that hierarchy. And if they're all at the same level, if there's no hierarchy, they're just all there, then you're completely confused, right? You value them all the same. And so when multiple are going off, there's kind of a war, but really you're just confused and you don't know what to do. And so this is like a similar thing of what happens whenever you have two worldviews that collide. They war together, and sometimes that ends up producing an actual war with actual deaths. But sometimes it stays cultural, or it stays political, or religious, or whatever level it's at. So there's that. And I say, as I previously stated, our current systems, along with our old and future systems, are imperfect and are in continuous need of transformation. It's not that we should abandon these works because our new knowledge seems to contradict them, but instead that we should update and transform them to fit our new understanding. So this is actually essentially the theory right here in this paragraph. This is actually like a half decent summary of everything I'm going to be talking to you about, but it's obviously more complicated than this. I'm going to explain it in at least 6 different ways. And I say that that is the purpose of this writing. And my hope is that this writing will continue to be transformed in the future, staying up to date and stretching ever so closer to the truth, to a more accurate, precise, and complete theory of everything. So again, what this section is about is it's about humanity's past and humanity's future, which I think is probably going to be relatively long. In the past, we had these worldviews, and when they collided, there was probably essentially always a war where people ended up dying. And so in that time period, you could make the argument that power was ruling, but that doesn't mean that power should rule. And the reason why it's obvious is because people were killing each other. We weren't developing, we weren't using our amazing minds to the best of our ability. We weren't using our intelligence for the right purposes. We were developing worldviews. We were thinking of patterns of behavior all associated with these different gods. And when two tribes had different gods, or two different ways of acting in the world, or two different belief systems, they would collide, and that would produce war, and that would produce death. And then the winning tribe, the one who had the better worldview, and you can maybe make the argument that they did actually have a better worldview, but just because they won a war doesn't necessarily mean that. Now, it isn't a terrible predictor, right? Because if they won the war, then maybe they were healthier, maybe they were smarter, maybe their ideas were actually better, but it isn't necessarily true that is always the case. And it certainly isn't true that mere forceful power rules. I mean, you see that quite well in the Christian passion. Christ doesn't exercise power. Now, he does flip tables and whip people. Like, he does do that. And that's actually very relevant. And it's sort of questionable to people who believe in the just be peaceful, no wars. Maybe you could call that an ideology, actually. Not necessarily a Christian belief, but actually an ideology. And then, of course, whenever Christ is arrested, Peter cuts off the ear of one of the guards, right? So he uses violence, and Christ says, don't do that. Whoever lives by the sword will die by the sword. And so he's making a critique there of violence. But it isn't violence in general. It's a specific type of violence, but I don't really understand it that well. But the idea is that power doesn't rule, right? So Christ says, he says, do not think that I've come to bring peace, but a sword. And he did bring a sword, but he didn't necessarily mean that literally, right? I think it's in Ephesians where Paul talks about the armor of God, and the sword is called the sword of truth, right? And so the sword is speech, and speech is like the way in which we communicate ideas. So we can communicate our belief systems, communicate which gods we believe in, communicate what patterns of behavior we act out. And so instead of fighting physically over that, we can fight verbally over that, and we can have debates, and that's way more productive. And I think that's true. And I think that's why free speech is so important, because the second you don't have free speech, power rules. And so it's either that power rules or that creative, transformative, and honest dialogue rules. You can choose between those. Maybe there's more options, but really you can choose between those two. And so I want you to understand that for hundreds of thousands of years, we've been trying to figure this out. And we've done quite well, right? Like Christianity is a highly developed religion. I think it's doing quite well at explaining the world, as far as I can tell. And even though it might be wrong on some things, or it might be imperfect, I think it is imperfect. I couldn't tell you what's wrong exactly, but I can tell you that it is imperfect, because all things are imperfect. That doesn't mean we have to just toss it out, or that we should, or that we even can. I think it's to the point now where Christianity is so foundational to Western civilization that you can't just replace it. You can't just snap your fingers and say, bam, it's gone, because it doesn't work like that. It's the foundation of our culture, and the foundation of our society. And you can try and replace that entirely, but it's not going to work, because nihilism can't replace Christianity, because nihilism is no belief. And some belief is very often better than no belief. And so even if Christianity or religion as a whole is imperfect, that doesn't mean you can just carelessly reject it or naively reject it. You have to accept at least part of it, and maybe all of it. Maybe you have to have that faith, or you have to accept the dogma, because you don't know everything, first of all. And second of all, you need at least a system of belief. So that's what we've been doing, and we've been doing quite a good job of it. And I think in the future, we are going to connect more dots, and we're going to understand more about reality. And we need not throw out the systems we already have, but instead update them with caution.